who don't know me, I'm Lindsay Harris. I'm the Andrew High School Arts Director here at the Academy. And today we are fortunate to hear from two Rome Prize winners whose fellowships were alas cut short during the pandemic years for reasons we all know far too well. But aside from this odd commonality, they also share, I think, an investigation in the relationship between people and the environment. And historically, maybe not at the moment, they have often used filmic media, photography or moving pictures, to investigate these relationships. We are so pleased to be able to welcome them today here to the podium and more generally back to Rome this fall. It's been a real gift to be able to have you back with us to complete in some way those curtailed fellowship experiences of years past. We will hear first from David Brooks, Rome Prize Fellow in Visual Arts. Central to David's artistic practice is an awareness of how cultural matters are inextricably intertwined with the natural world. Through a meditative, methodical process of fact-gathering and observation, David lets the situations he encounters determine the format of his art, which you can imagine ranges vastly in its final outcomes. These have been shown in a host of important exhibitions, including shows at Storm King Art Center and the De Cordova Museum, both in New York, and presentations on the PBS series Art 21, which for those of you who don't know it is a wonderful platform for contemporary artists to share their ideas with audiences across the United States, and thanks to its online capacity also around the world. A research grant to the Ecuadorian Amazon from the Koipu Foundation and a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, among others, have also fueled David's creativity, along with the Rome Prize, of course. Next, we will hear from James Casebere, the Abigail Cohen Rome Prize Fellow in the Visual Arts. To give you a sense of the breadth of James's accomplishments as a photographer, a term I use loosely as his art pushes this term well into the realm of architecture, today he will share with us the arc of his career dating to 1975. Over the years, James has earned numerous grants, residencies, and solo exhibitions, each of which in some way has provided him the opportunity to halt what he referred to in conversation with me as the production mode, in which he usually operates, to open himself up to the possibilities of change, to new directions. These include an early residency at Villa Montalvo in the Bay Area of California, a MacDowell Fellowship in 1994, followed soon thereafter by a Guggenheim Fellowship, and not one but 3 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His mid-career retrospective at the Haus der Kunst in Munich in 2016-17 permitted James to reflect on his achievements and welcome a turning point in his creative practice. He has continued to pursue new avenues in his art at the American Academy in Rome, as we will hear more this morning. Following both presentations, we will welcome David and James here to take questions from the audience, and during the half hour or so after the shop talk and questions before lunch, James has kindly invited us to stop by his studio to see 2 works in progress, and that would be Studio 253. So please do pop up if you have time. Let's now begin our morning by welcoming to the podium our first speaker, David Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, for organizing this and those very eloquent introductions. And thank you to the Academy, yes, that we were able to make this time to come back and be with all the extraordinary minds and makers that are here. What they say about the American Academy is actually all true, I can now say, for sure. So much of my work, as Lindsay kind of touched on, is really looking at how the natural world is something that, how we define it, how we perceive it, and then therefore how we define it often leads to how we utilize it and impact it, very much as an image of our own selves. And so not to kind of start autobiographically, but to just be a little bit autobiographical, I'm from Brazil, Indiana, which is this very small town south of Chicago, surrounded by cornfields stretching to the horizon, and which is really a monoculture of industrial agriculture. And so I grew up with a very specific kind of idea of what the living world was. It was later in life, as I was exposed to places of great diversity without the kind of anthropogenic impact on them, that my mind was really blown. And so I feel like most of my adult life, I've been kind of reconciling these worlds between what it means as an artistic practice and what it means to also engage the living world of non-humans around us. But I wanted to not just read about these things in books or on headlines, but to actually be a part of processes that really engage the living world, and especially scientific knowledge production. So for many years, I've been partaking in biodiversity surveys here in the Everglades, doing bird census programs, fish tagging programs here in Guyana with some bird tagging projects. This is a very, very cute golden-headed manakin, an extraordinary bird with an interesting dancing, mating dance. And I was working with these biologists. This is in the Amazon basin where I've spent many, many years now. And I was really working with these biologists on biodiversity surveys that I began to really see also the very limitations of scientific production, because a place like the Amazon basin is extraordinarily diverse, and it really tests or challenges our processes of understanding it and seeing it. I say that because in almost every single biodiversity survey we've done, there's somewhere between 4 to 6 species unknown to science that are usually collected, and that's just the ones that I've been a part of. So the living world really is this extraordinary, fascinating place. I really do a lot of the kind of field work, the grunt work, but I also help fundraise for these scientific expeditions. I've also been able to help describe and then therefore kind of name scientifically species. This is the first fish that was able to help work on that, which is named after my undergraduate art teacher, whose name was Urzi Schwartz. So this is E. schwartzi, or Ancestris E. schwartzi. In the same family of fish is this, which is a fish that's evolved to look like wood as a defensive measure. This is also the same family of fish, which has evolved to be able to eat wood. And so one can begin to see how a boy from Brazil, Indiana, surrounded by cornfields might be quite amazed at what the fantastical relationships of the natural world can really provide. But the fieldwork itself is also an interesting moment. It's very much a cultural situation. People are still moody, they're hungry, they're tired. They're choosing places to sample based on also their comfort levels or their own personal subjective interests, and that's really quite fascinating for me. But I do really think that these biologists, the conservation biologists, are some of the most kind of avant-garde thinkers today, because they're trying to kind of merge deep time geological situations with immediate threats on the environment. We're studying areas often that are about to be maybe erased or bulldozed, either for soy cultivation or for oil exploration or highway development, or often also very much hydroelectric dams. And so that moment of just witnessing and being present with it, not as a statistic, but as a really visceral kind of moment in the fieldwork process, is very important for me. These are not just statistics, but they're living beings that we are around. But sometimes it's also just really important to kind of just show your affection and your love for the non-humans that we also share this world with. An earlier project from about 10 years ago that I think was the first one for me that really put these worlds together in a way that, that I felt was it was kind of like a foundational work that helped catapult a number of other works where these ideas can actually be generators for a situation. And so at PS1, I wanted to kind of do a project around a very old story, that of deforestation. And it's one that's an ancient situation that comes with humanity and civilization, but it's one whose scale and speed accelerates with every coming year. And so the level of alarmingness, is an urgency, continues to increase. So it's a very strange kind of place to live in, and it's one of the hallmarks of our time, I feel. We also often see this kind of violence on the landscape from far away through images. And so I wanted to figure out a way to really make that something that could be witnessed and physical and tangible. But just to kind of give a backstory, we had done a biodiversity survey along stretches of this road, which is called the Interoceanica, arguably the largest road building project in the world, This was in 2010, and it's still not completed, but it's crisscrossing the entire Amazon basin for the exportation of soy. When one experiences a place like that, you can begin to see or have the kind of notion that we're paving over the Amazon. And I want to take that notion between the biodiversity and the richness of life that I'm experiencing and this very in the moment kind of erasure or paving over. So I wanted to create what I was calling a preserved forest. And so the idea was really that I would go down to South Florida and bring back to New York City, to PS1, to the museum, dozens upon dozens of species of trees and plants that were from Amazon areas, but they're actually grown in South Florida nurseries for the landscaping industry. So here in the duplex gallery, we planted a kind of cross-section of an Amazonian forest. And then, of course, obviously what we need to do is cover it in concrete. And so over a period of a couple of weeks, there was about 20 tons of concrete that we dumped, pumped, and sprayed on the forest. When the exhibition first opened, it had this quality as though there was kind of like an ice storm that had moved through the forest where every single leaf and branch was kind of frozen in this crystalline kind of concrete, and the lava flows of the excess of concrete spilling through, sort of a Mount Vesuvius moment. But I also use specific plant species and trees that I knew were very resilient to disturbance and erosion and so forth. So actually over time then the piece began to regrow. And so it was this idea that one could kind of go back to this piece over. It was up for almost 2 years, and it was originally meant to be only up for about 8 months. And then everybody started seeing the life cycles happen. It's like, do you think we could keep it up another year or so? And so it remained on view, and it went through these various life cycles, a way of taking a kind of monumental sculpture that typically is very static and the one just kind of stares at. And actually, this is one that one can witness it change and move on its own accord in a sense. What I do with a lot of projects is that I also think about the life of the material after. For me, it's not just the moment of the exhibition, but also the before, during, and after of a project. And so this is one where all of the concrete then was jackhammered up and then was recycled into precast like concrete drain culverts and sewer lines. So there's a company in New York and the Bronx that we worked with to recycle all that material. Another project that was around, I guess this is about 9 years ago now, but it was called Desert Rooftops. And again, kind of taking ideas around our situation of kind of biodiversity loss and our moment of being hyper aware of the very destruction that our own way of life kind of imposes on other landscapes, and yet we're hyper aware of that and yet live it still and still continue to be complicit in it. And it's not that, and I'm complicit in it, and my way of life is complicit in it. So it's a very kind of strange, irrational moment of this time. So, and this is, desertification is one that is equally as old as deforestation, going back as far as civilization itself, and one where we kind of over-harvest the landscape, overgraze it, cut down the trees, we overuse it, and it becomes almost like inhospitable to other life forms. And so, of course, this is a common scene for me in Brazil, Indiana, and this monoculture, again, inhospitable to other living forms, can also be seen very much in the very concept and form of our suburban sprawls and built environment. So with a little bit of poetic license, I just kind of began to kind of merge these spaces, both conceptually and formally, kind of together into a project that was in Times Square. It was this empty lot that was an old kind of brothel back in the seedy days of Times Square that was bulldozed or torn down, and then it was going to become a massive skyscraper, and then the recession hit, so it lay dormant for many years after 2008. So it's a perfect place to build suburban rooftops, of course. And so what it was, a project where the rooftops were constructed, and they were all built according to New York City building code, because we had to submit plans for permits and so forth. And of course, they saw them as rooftops. And so if it looks like a rooftop, it must be a building. And so it was actually built according to code and would have lasted for probably 50 to 100 years. But it was only up for 3 months. So it was built to code, but it was designed and shaped and kind of formed according to the way sand dunes themselves are formed. So it had a kind of conventional construction, but an unconventional form and design and shape. There was interpretive signs around the property there, or they called the last lot, because it was the last lot of land that was not constructed on in Times Square. And the interpretive signs are really designed after how the National Park Service of the United States designs their signs. And so here we have a kind of big sweeping landscape view, a little definition of what desertification is, and then and how sand dunes are formed, but no mention of rooftops. So people, of course, are meant to kind of reconcile that situation in their own minds of what's actually happening here and what's fueling this kind of form and what's generating that form. Like the preserved forest, then I wanted to make sure that this material had a life and continued on after the exhibition moment. And so all of the materials were then taken back apart and then donated to Habitat for Humanity, and so where they could become real rooftops. And so that element of just continuing the life of a work past the exhibition is always a very important element for me. Pieces were then also kind of extractions were taken out as like artifacts as part of a separate thing at the Tang Museum, where they have a kind of archive around the project and its history. So speaking of ecosystems, I mean, an ecosystem is an interesting phenomenon because you can't walk up to a forest edge and just immediately see ecosystem. And yet we are also, believe it or not, in an ecosystem right now. but it's a very strange kind of hypothetical sensibility around it. So I want to create a situation where one can kind of see or feel these peculiar elements and abstracted qualities of what ecosystem is. And so pulling from my, again, upbringing around these types of landscapes, sites, and machineries, combine harvester. This is a machine that does kind of 50 different operations at once, maybe more like 15, but it feels like 50. And make an analogy between that and an ecosystem itself, a place and a situation or a phenomenon that you can't really perceive all of its elements in one moment. It's only through your imagination and your interpretive capacity that one can begin to really see and experience an ecosystem. So the entire combine harvester was disassembled into all of its thousands of pieces. And then the idea was to reorder it or reorganize it through the layout of the museum and according to 9 different ecosystem services. This is purposefully kind of convoluted and complicated of an arrangement so that one actually begins to relax trying to make A plus B equals C, but actually utilize their own interpretive capabilities. And so as you walk into the museum, it has this feeling as though it's like an exploded drawing of sorts, but that notion kind of quickly gives way to a different set of organizings of materials. The viewer, of course, knows that when they walk in that every single last bolt and nut and piece of this machine is in the museum without a single piece excluded, but all arranged here according to ecosystem services. It becomes then very much an interpretive moment for the viewer, where if you're given a title for a piece, and every single piece had a title, I feel so bad for the archivists and registrars there who we worked for months on making, hundreds of labels for these. And so if I say airborne particle interception, and then you see an image like this, your mind begins to make those interpretive qualities. If I say decaying leaves, even though these are sandblasted samplings of every single piece of, every type of hardware in the tractor, but I say decaying leaves and show you this, your mind begins to kind of make interpretive qualities around it. And then various materials had other kind of surface transformations to it. Here they're brass plated, brought to a high polish. These are kind of this is almost like the brains of the machine in a way, or the stomach in a sense. And as it's sprawled on out to the back of the museum, you have the shells of the machine that become part of habitat formation. Once you reach that point, you're exhausted. And so you now can relax and walk back to the museum and just take confidence in what you are actually seeing and projecting onto these various museological situations. This is a piece that is kind of beginning to lead towards what I've been thinking about and being in Rome. And it was a very kind of simple in one way and not in others, but it's part of the commuter biennial in Miami, which was a biennial that was really meant to only be seen by commuters. So it was things that were only visible by highways from the airports, from the bus stations, from the train station, and so forth. And it was a way, it started out as a little bit of a joke. And then me and this person who was not a curator wrote up this idea or premise, and we ended up getting an enormous grant from the Knight Foundation to do this, so, which was great. My kind of reference point, though, is like what is ever present in a place like Miami. These constant building constructions everywhere. It's a never-ending sprawl, kind of a beast of kind of development. But at the same time, then the impacts of that, which is that we see constantly, this kind of from commercial harvesting of the sea, of course, bycatch or ghost fish, as they're often called. And so I was kind of merging these two forms in a similar manner as I had done in the past to create a kind of irrational situation. This is the site, kind of looking from Google Maps, and where it says Blue Lagoon is where this piece was positioned, which was only visible by the highway, which is Highway 836. So we're kind of towing it into place here, and then the cars zipping by on the highway, kind of all scratching their heads. It's like, what on earth this thing is. You can imagine social media was blowing up around this. There was no interpretive signage anywhere for this. So the commuters were just having this odd moment of trying to understand what this piece was. And because this lagoon was dredged to make the airport, it's a very barren subaquatic landscape. So the original intention for this was that once this piece is done with this exhibition kind of display moment, we would actually sink it in order to make an artificial reef, sort of like an artificial habitat for the fish themselves. And so the next step, of course, with this is that I need to get my scuba diving certification so I can go and document the process that's been unfolding for the last 2 years there. And Lindsay mentioned the Storm King. And I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Storm King. There's probably quite a few people. And for those that haven't, Storm King is a sculpture park that's 1 hour north of New York City. It's one of the first of its kind that took in this large landscape situation to basically make, in short, a kind of a museum of modern art in the landscape itself. And an interesting part of it is that the landscape of Storm King itself was sculpted over time. And so I was kind of interested in this idea of the terraforming, the sculpting of a landscape, how we perceive the landscape. And so Leo Marx in 1964 wrote this famous book, The Machine in the Garden, The American Pastoral, and he kind of uses examples dating from the late 19th century of American artists that were really kind of encapsulating or demonstrating or illustrating this idea of the machine in the garden, which is this moment of what he was describing as where we are looking at a pastoral situation, which here George Ennis is really showing the kind of dichotomy of this, where he's using the pastoral mandates of like establishing a sense of scale in the foreground and the tree. There's a person in the landscape to let the viewer into the landscape. This big sweeping view to the middle that is really in a way of like dominating the landscape from the human gaze. And then kind of the morning mist or dew in the background with always ending with either a forest line or a mountain ridge to insinuate infinity beyond it. But of course, what we're seeing here is factory smog and the charging train of industrial progress coming through the image and a deforestation in the foreground. So an interesting part of this is what Storm King looks like today, which was, as I said, a landscape that was sculpted. And they took about 6 years of moving thousands of loads of dump trucks of earth and bulldozing to kind of shape it into even more of a Hudson River School idea of the Hudson River, which is ironically, this is in the Hudson River, which I found really fascinating. So I wanted to really put the machine back in the garden itself, so quite literally. And so we actually had to seek out this guy right here, which would have been the exact model that would have been used to help sculpt this landscape in the early 60s. And so with this, then we placed it into the landscape, where it becomes a little bit ambiguous as to which one's really dominant. Is it the hillside, which is a man-made hill, or is it the machine itself? It has a very kind of brutal slicing through the machine, through the driver's section, but with these shaftways that open up, and you can kind of see just elements of it spanning the shaftway space. Of course, we put the metal grates on there so that one can walk across it and very slowly take in the read of these things. Storm King, which has a lot of of course, beautiful representatives of sculpture from that era of the 60s with very large metal works that you can kind of see from 2 kilometers away, or speeding by on the New York State Thruway at 75 miles an hour. And so this is kind of the inversion of that, where one has to really go step by step, looking down at where they're walking, putting together in their mind the landscape that they're traversing. And so another project at Storm King a few years later, kind of continuing on some ideas around how to think about a site, a landscape, how we form landscape into our own kind of cultural notions and ideals. This project called Permanent Field Observations. So again, Storm King, with its larger metal things, I wanted to kind of look in the opposite direction. So here I had kind of gone in the perimeter here, which is the unmanicured kind of wooded areas of Storm King, and just finding little ephemeral situations, really subjectively just following my own flights of fancy along the trail and identifying 30 different situations that I found of interest, and then made bronze copies of them. So just an interesting little pile of sticks, which you maybe normally would just walk right across in the woods, taking that moment, kind of fossilizing it in time, and there's about 1 meter of concrete below that with anchoring rods going into the landscape. So the idea is that these things that are ephemeral, kind of subjective findings within the landscape, also have a certain element of permanence or an idea of foreverness. And so the forever part was what was interesting for me, showing just kind of some of the lost wax process and the makings of them. And then also here there was even a deer skeleton that was in one of the fields, placing now one of them next to the very thing that it was cast from, as almost like a time capsule into the future in a way. And the interpretive signage around this project just basically says they were made in 2018, but they're kind of there forever. So this notion of forever is a kind of weird and interesting one, reconciling this very quietude moment in the woods with this idea of foreverness. And for me, that the real art part was ultimately when we were able to kind of craft a contract that would incorporate notions of foreverness. So the idea here is that as storms happen, as climate change alters our landscapes, as species go extinct, as erosion happens, that Storm King will not move them and they will not manicure them, that they remain in place forever. And so that's this idea of having a conversation also with a future generation, or creating, as I said, a kind of time capsule moment where these pieces will maybe be found in a future time with this number stamped in them that corresponds with an archive. Some of these have also already been destroyed, like this one in particular has already had some logs that fell on top of it. And they wanted to kind of, should we pull the logs off and move them? And I showed them the contract. It's like, no, we leave them as is. They get folded into the landscape. They are now part of the landscape. So if 300 years from now, Storm King ceases to exist and it becomes a kind of a holiday hotel spa or something, they still cannot remove them. So, and that's a notion that I think I've been really dealing with also, even here in Rome, a place where you have, of course, these layered notions of time that is both about the past and the future in a sense. And then, so even more along those lines of how we begin to kind of intertwine these notions of time in our built environment, and especially involving the living world around us. This is an inaugural project for Governor's Island, for the Trust for Governor's Island. And for those that don't know what Governor's Island is, it's an island just off Battery Park on the southern tip of Manhattan. It's been a military outpost since the Dutch 300 years ago. It was decommissioned as a military and Coast Guard outpost with the President Clinton administration. He sold it to the city for $1 for the one stipulation that it does not become private development like Trump or Towers or something along those lines. So the project, though, was to really incorporate its history, something about the history of the place, thinking through what those might be and how the public can kind of engage with this place that is becoming a new kind of destination for people in the city, Its military and colonial history is very strong and very present. It's very legible. It's kind of legible everywhere you go on that island. And even, this was an image from World War II, every single shoelace and bullet that went to Europe would pass through Governor's Island on various ships. So that notion of the military might of it, its history, and that legacy is very present. And I wanted to blow right on past all of that and to go into thousands of years and look at the last ice age, when the Laurentide ice sheet had covered that part of up to New York City, as well as its kind of geologic past, and kind of put it in comparison or in a kind of context of a deep time and a current situation. This is the island today. That southern part of the island is all from fill from when they excavated to do the subway lines in New York. And the top part of it's sort of like an ice cream cone. The ice cream part is the original footprint of the island. So I identified 3 areas with the archaeologists of the island where we could extract this history. So naturally, of course, one brings in a rotosonic drill in order to do these core extractions. We went down to about 125 feet with each one. It kind of varied depending on the site, and extracting all the way past through the glacial period and on into the deeper parts of the Manhattan schists, which date to around 571 million years. And so extracting these kind of elements of time, these tangible elements of time, and then placing back in that kind of that well or core hole a permanent marker, as well as a plaque that kind of describes what we had done on that date, as well as describing a little bit about the life of the place and the living world around it. For instance, on this one, I wrote about squirrels, because squirrels are not naturally found on the island because they can't swim. But it was the soldiers in the 19th century that brought squirrels to the island for entertainment and novelty reasons. One of the sites, this is the second site in front of the old hospital there. And then now I had the problem, though, of how to display these rock cores, because it's kind of hard to relate to a rock. So how can one begin to see and sense these layers and intertwinements of time happening? This is the fort that's in the center of the island, and I wanted to put and install this in the subterranean section of the space, which is where they used to keep all the ammunitions and so forth. But also in that subterranean space, which is called the magazine, the Asian tiger mosquito breeds in the summertime. As I learned, as I was doing some kind of reconnaissance work there. And this is an invasive species that came in the 80s. New York City is pretty much the northernmost point where the Asian tiger mosquito breeds. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until around 2016, because of the Zika virus, where the government was putting millions upon millions of dollars into mosquito research, that we really began for the first time to understand how mosquitoes even fly. And so that became a really interesting part for me, and I worked with an entomologist at Auburn University who was part of this study to kind of map some of these flight forms. Another kind of living non-human in the environment around the fort is the ruby-throated hummingbird, which breeds on the fort itself, and which has a very well documented and understood kind of flight pattern studies around it. So using those as existing ready-made forms, and then brought that notion into the subterranean space and overlap the kind of hummingbird flight pattern with the mosquito form. And that would kind of tell me how I can lay out these rock cores in a way that could begin to be sensed in a different way. Through projection mapping and other forms of laying out these flight patterns throughout the subterranean caverns, we then begin to create a kind of armature and that would hold these rock cores through the space. As one approaches the tunnel that goes down, you of course see the tops of like the sidewalk or the tops of the asphalt parking lot in one of them. And then as you move down into the tunnel, you have this kind of movement, of course, following the chronologically, geologically, timelines moving down. It then begins it starts out kind of subtle, the intertwinement of these flight patterns. And as one moves further on down into the space, it becomes much more intertwined, showing where the glacial period ends and the kind of larger schist material that's many million years older picks up. it may appear as though things are moving. They're not really kinetically moving the way we understand movement, though we all know that rocks, though they appear static, are actually always moving and forming. And as the piece kind of meanders around the subterranean space, at the terminating point of each line of flight is another plaque. So didactics, as you can see, I often use them in a formal and conceptual manner throughout different works. So here talking about, of course, the hummingbird and that it beats its wings 80 times per second, etc. And it can hover perfectly motionless in the air, and these kind of extraordinary aspects of it that are also dictating the very form in front of you. Whereas here we have the meandering, kind of drunken flight of the mosquito as it moves through the space with its terminating plaque, telling the viewer that, in fact, as we know now, the mosquito can beat its wings up to 800 times per second, which it challenges my imagination for sure, just like thinking of a rock being 570 million years in formation. For me, they are kind of like both a way to ascertain a kind of difficulty of time and space in the very moment of it. I get often asked from people, like, we know what you get from scientists, but do scientists ever get anything from artists? And so, which is an interesting question. So I can say that this rock material right here, this kind of rosy, smoky pegmatite, was the first time it was ever seen in the New York City region. And so there's a geologist that wrote a paper on this geologic material and kind of added it to the geologic maps of the region. So I can finally say that to my students also. The last piece I'm going to show you, which again, this idea of thinking in towards the future, thinking beyond this kind of just this moment of seeing an object or a site or a space or a place, but thinking in a conversation with a future notion. Is a piece that was done during the pandemic in a place in Oyster Bay, New York, just past Queens, and in a place called Planting Fields. So Planting Fields is a 100-year-old, it was originally an indigenous kind of farming area. It was called Planting Fields in the indigenous language because it was a place that was very rich for agriculture. Fast forward to 1918, and Wilco and Mayco made this very large estate on the area there. He was a CEO at Standard Oil. And it was a landscape that was designed actually by Frederick Law Olmsted's sons. And Olmsted was the designer of Central Park, as well as many other kind of famous landscape architectural situations around the United States. And this was an inaugural project they were doing at Planting Fields because it had been over 100 years since they had commissioned artwork. And so there was a new director, and she wanted to commission artworks for the first time in a century. So Mark and I were thinking about how to kind of articulate these notions of the culture of nature that exists there at this site. And so we live in a moment where, of course, like species extinction, habitat destruction are kind of like part of our daily headlines in the news. But it's also a moment where bird watching and things like nature observation are equally increasing. So it's this interesting moment where we're watching, especially during the pandemic, you know, there's a lot of people that started the whole bird watching craze. And both Mark and I, being avid bird watchers ourselves, decided that we would utilize the bird blind structure as a form to work from. So just a reference image of a bird blind, which is like where one kind of can look through the structure at the nature in front of them without disturbing or spooking the birds or the other wildlife in front of them. So it's a very typical form that one will see in a kind of quote-unquote nature park. So we want to use that as a form the way one might use like doing a bust, a self-portrait, or a still life. This would be our kind of basis of the forum to talk about the culture of nature. And so Mark's work typically looks at not the nature itself directly, but really about the nature observer and the cultures created around how we see the nature. So this is very much about the nature observer, not really about birds, but really about how we see birds. I wanted to use what was actually in the site itself and really work with the birds and the habitat itself. So I made a kind of recapitulation of this structure here, which is the oldest structure on the property in the site, which is actually now a state park. The whole site is a state park. So I wanted to make a recapitulation of this, but first I wanted to add on to the forest that was existing, kind of expand the edge of the forest, almost like thinking around what we call forest succession. So forest succession is when a forest moves almost like a body. It expands and contracts and has these kind of changes in its bodily form throughout time. So first we planted the trees and then built the structure around it. That's me on the roof there, cutting holes. Don't do this at home. And this is kind of like what the final form looks like. Of course, the trees kind of working through and integrating with and kind of having a struggle or an engagement with the blind itself, piercing through on certain edges, and as well as creating sites where people can kind of come and observe the kind of the bird life in front of them. And you can see Mark's piece there through the window. But the project was really not just about that. It was really more about this idea into the future and using the sculptural moment as a kind of excuse to create real habitat itself. So the idea here is that over time it would change and that we'd be an active agents in the alteration of it. So here's our site, and we plant our trees, and then we build our bird blinder structure. And as the trees grow in and mature and get bigger and bigger, we take sections of the structure away. And so it's sort of like a ruin, a slow ruin in a sense, but also an articulated ruin. And to what we're left with is of kind of fully fledged addition to the forest that are all bird attractive trees. So in regards to kind of like being in Rome, and that notion is something that I'm beginning to work with some ornithologists and other people around how to think through how the built environment can kind of be seen of Rome in a kind of different perspective and on into this notion maybe even of the future in a sense. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
All right, that's a hard act to follow. That was fun. Let's see. Anybody need a break? Take a deep breath. All right, where do I start here? Okay. Great. So, yeah, we make very different kinds of work. Let me just start with the first image. I believe that we both kind of came out of a similar conceptual background or base, but anyway, since this is this crazy attempt to show sample or survey my work from the very beginning, this is the first image that I considered an artwork, actually. And this was shot in 1975. It was called Fan as Eudaemonist, Relaxing After an Exhausting Day at the Beach. So I just want to tie this into what Lee Moore was saying yesterday about documenting performances and actions of all sorts. I was very influenced by artists of the time who were involved in earthworks, temporary installations, body art, and so I wanted to take the photograph, I wanted to get away from the photograph as a document and take it to a different place, to move it to the next level, and make the photograph the primary artwork, not the action that occurred before the snapping of the shutter. So this is also very much about my understanding of postmodernism at the time through, well, in this case, it was Harold Bloom. I'd gone to a beach in Minneapolis and sat in the sun and finished reading The Anxiety of Influence and went home on my bike, and at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I threw this together in a very eclectic way, maybe. At any rate, I was quoting other artists. I had been working a little bit with Klaus Oldenburg at the Walker Arts Center. I replaced an art handler whose thumb was crushed by a giant clothespin. And so I began to make things small, miniature, that were a bit toy-like, which for me referred a little bit to the softness of his sculpture. But I utilized the fan in kind of a symbolic way to signify wind or inspiration. And in this case, it's also the kind of archetypal setting for the American TV sitcom. The fan is sitting there watching television. And the photo on the wall is, of course, something of great importance to a fan, an electrical outlet. But anyway, so this is called Fork in the Refrigerator. And I, at this point, as you can see, was using a central object in a kind of anthropomorphic way. I began to do away with that gradually, but it was an everyday object. This image is called Bacillus pestis, to be looked at while listening to Schumann's Scenes from Childhood, Section 3, Catch Me. So it's really about getting up in the morning for me as a child and looking at animated cartoons from the early 20th century, Disney cartoons and such, where you had mice dancing on piano keys. And I would be all alone by myself at this little table and chair. And I swear that one morning, a bunch of mice came running out from behind the table, and rather the TV, this little nook that we had built in the wall for the television set, and disappeared under the couch behind me. So I don't know whether that was a dream or a memory, but it was really about that confusion. This is a bed upturning its belly at dawn. I went to New York, and actually I started this series when I was in the Whitney Independent Study Program in 1977, and did a series of 10 photographs that were really about editing. But they were a visual group that related to one another formally, ending in this image of the Staten Island Ferry arriving in Manhattan, sort of a reversal of an Alfred Stieglitz photograph from the early 20th century. This courtroom was one of the first things I shot later on after graduate school, after making a bunch of films and pixelated movies and film installations and color and stuff. But I wanted to just put it all together in a single image, one at a time, instead of working with movement and installation and whatnot. So it was like constructive. It was a nod to sort of a constructivist approach to me. It involved being, I wanted to be everything. I wanted to be a designer, a sculptor, an architect, a photographer. I wanted to refer to movies and to my own history as an artist whose internal unconscious image base was really rooted in my experience with television as part of that first generation. But I took this image and I made it into a poster and plastered it around the city, just kind of anonymously, to be absorbed within the writing of the walls, the graffiti found everywhere on construction sites, or etc. I made this image, which is called Boats, and it was kind of pivotal for me also. I was living downtown in, I guess what we now refer to as Tribeca, but back then it was Wall Street area, or Fulton Fish Market. And I was really moved by the way the buildings looked like boats. But I also wanted to make a conventional picture that was influenced, again, by kind of Robert Venturi and complexity and contradiction in architecture, where the idea was to learn from the everyday, learning, you know, Main Street is almost all right kind of attitude. And so the notion of a convention that I could replicate was a large part of this process of making pictures, hence the idea of the pictures generation, I guess. But it's a little bit of a nod to Hitchcock and his movie Lifeboat, but also the reliefs, the downtown WPA reliefs on a lot of the buildings in the Wall Street area, but also about putting the viewer in the center of the frame, surrounded by the larger, what I thought of as social forces that are overwhelming him or her. This was called Sutpen's Cave. So I'm moving a little bit out of my immediate home-like experience into the broader social world and reading William Faulkner and thinking about place as something that I felt was significant to what I was doing. And here, of course, it's about this dichotomy between the plantation and the holler in the South. It's about, in a big way, place, but also history, social history, in the way it is connected to personal history, kind of a collective versus individual experience. And it comes from a very pivotal moment in Absalom, where the main protagonist, Thomas Sutpen, hatches his plans. He's migrating from West Virginia to Mississippi to start a new life with his father, and he is sent on an errand to this plantation house. They're very poor, and he's humiliated, let's put it that way, by going to the back door of this plantation, and decides to become a rich plantation owner himself, and hence goes to the West Indies, does so, gets wealthy, moves back to Minnesota, and the rest of, I'm sorry, Mississippi, and becomes a, Southern, whatever, aristocrat. This is called Kitchen Table. It's kind of about, for me, the kitchen as a symbol of stability and security and peace as used by Madison Avenue advertising, somewhat subverted by the dark shadow in the center and the uncanniness in the black and white. So, film noir is having a big influence on me in general in this period. I took a lot of those images and then installed them in commercial light boxes in the Staten Island ferry terminal, because I wasn't really interested in the gallery situation. I wasn't that attached to photography as a fine art or on its own or in its own category. And I was more interested in sort of subverting one's expectations in unusual situations. And I think that this is also a bit of a nod to Gordon Matta Clark, and I think David does this too with his rooftops, for example, that he was pretty influential. I wanted to work on the fringes of the city, not at the heart of the gallery system. And so 70,000 people a day would pass through this room on their way to Manhattan every day. This is an image called Storefront. I could talk a lot about each of these, but I know we only have so much time, so maybe just enjoy some of these images if I pass over them and don't say a word. Yeah. This is another moment where I'm thinking about postmodernism as a new phenomena, and I grew up in Livonia, Michigan, just outside Detroit, where I went home one Christmas, I guess, for a vacation, to get out of New York and visit the family, and discovered a whole new neighborhood where each block was built in a radically different architectural style. So I kind of went back to New York and then decided to create my own architectural style that was a combination of what I thought of as a Brooklyn brownstone, a Baltimore row house, and a middle-class suburban colonial style house. And this is what resulted. So from that, I guess I went back out to California to teach, and I began spending a little bit of time driving across the West. And I know that some people in this room might recognize this place. It's actually based on Canyonlands National Monument, where I have never been, but I began to think about the Western landscape and the history of photography in relation to the West and the conquest of the West, let's say, but also the formation of American identity as this fantasy of the rugged individual and the idea of the West as an empty terrain where it was ready for our habitation. And so also about the way film helped create this idea for American identity based on a pulp fiction of the 1870s. And at this time we had Hollywood president, Ronald Reagan, who was, we thought of as kind of a cowboy from the West. And there was this whole fantasy about American I don't know, aggressiveness, and he began getting involved more in Middle Eastern politics and such. And so this is based on a film called Red River, and with kind of fake arrows. They have suction cups on them, I guess. And I went from that to doing a series of large-scale sculptural installations, the first of which was done at Sonsbeck in Arnhem, Holland, which is an exhibition outdoors in a large, beautiful park. But there's a villa where I installed something similar to this on the 3rd floor. But this was commissioned by the Walker Art Center and done in 1987, I think. It traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and a number of other museums and things, and galleries. But this was its first installation. One interesting thing is, when it was done at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, it was done on the 2nd floor in front of a big glass window on the street, so that people on the street could look up and see it as almost like a billboard, which, I don't know, I got a kick out of. But I think there were like 99 parts to this. And it's essentially shaved styrofoam, carved styrofoam, covered in fiberglass and paint. But I'm thinking about sculpture at this point as image rather than anything substantial. I'm ignoring the traditional attributes of sculpture in terms of weight, mass, gravity. It's weightless. It's ephemeral. It's inflated. It's an illusion. So I'm trying to get at this idea that this is a fantasy, that this is an inflated notion of white dominance, I guess you could say. So up until that point, a lot of the images are also, they're all white. And with this next installation, which I did, kind of ties in with David a little bit. It has to do with disaster and environment and storms. This was done for the University of South Florida in Tampa. It was quite large. It traveled around a bit. It was originally alone by itself in the middle of a room, but we got it to New York for a gallery exhibition, and it was too big for I think it was the biggest gallery in New York at the time. But it actually had to be pushed through that wall. We had to break through the wall to fit it in the space. But I did like the way it was cramped, and it kind of forced the viewer to navigate around it to get to the other galleries behind. It was called Tree Trunk with Broken Bungalow and Shotgun Houses. This is another piece that I did in Bruges, Belgium, shortly thereafter, in a round gallery, a very beautiful, I'm not sure what century house it was, old building, with similar references. And an image called Street with Pots that I shot, meant to look like the Southwest, kind of inspired by A Touch of Evil, and based on a street in Naples, actually, that I found in complexity and contradiction in architecture, a little thumbnail image. So a lot of my sources come from books. I don't travel the world to find these things and then come home and make images and build models based on that experience. I'll often do the research and make photographs based on little ratty pictures, and then go visit the places that I've read about and made work about after the fact. So I was, however, spending a lot of time in Europe, and got interested in the Enlightenment as an era of where we created or differentiated different cultural institutions, and like the prison, the poorhouse, the school, the monastery, what are some other ones? Insane asylum. And one of those institutions was the prison, which I kind of avoided for a while because I had read Foucault, Discipline and Punishment, a lot of his other work, and I was all, that's all well and good, but I kind of felt like it was all about prison as metaphor. And I felt like I was living in the middle of this massive prison construction boom in America that was really problematic. And so I just set about making models of 9 different prison typologies that were developed primarily in the US. This is an image based on Sing Sing. this is a panopticon prison actually designed by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Latrobe in Richmond, Virginia. This is Eastern Pennsylvania State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which I visited innumerable times, which I then set on fire before moving on. And these are something called Georgian jail cages, which are mobile jail cells post-Reconstruction in a time when a black man primarily might be arrested on the street for being unemployed and then hauled off by the state and rented out to his previous plantation owner as labor. The state would charge them a nominal fee. So it was really, slavery by another name. But I began to look at the monastery as a historic source for this notion of incarceration and as a actually Quaker reform, a progressive reform to take punishment away from the realm of capital punishment and public executions, public mutilations and displays of violence. This is an image I just kind of invented. I saw a room like this in Philadelphia, actually. Toilets, all in an undivided space. This is a later addition to Eastern Pennsylvania State Pen. The site for a famous scene in 12 Monkeys with Brad Pitt, I think. This was the mental hospital. And then I'm trying to group these separately, but to keep moving a little bit closely. I began to work with water. I made a trip to Berlin, spent a little time there. I shot this picture based on the bunkers under the Reichstag in Berlin. And it was at a time when there was a lot of enthusiasm about the future, a lot of optimism about the unification of Germany. And I just could not feel like we're forgetting the past. Like, I'm still in mourning, I guess. And so, so the water was really about I don't think I've ever gotten choked up about this image before, but it's really about the loss of life and memory and amidst all that optimism. Let's put it that way. So I transferred that metaphor to the Atlantic slave trade, and this particular image is based on a space that was a slave factory in West Africa. I simply flooded it. This is Monticello, and I was interested in the way Thomas Jefferson was at this point being reevaluated and taken down off his pedestal and being seen as part and parcel of the Atlantic slave trade, as an active participant and proponent of it, in fact. So this is an image that I shot based on a room at the Louvre, and I like it because it kind of, after the fact, it brought back this notion that I had this bank of memories from, in this case, Fantasia, and this great scene called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where, if anyone remembers that, it's a crazy image where the space is flooded by this wild magician and there's a mouse involved and whatnot. But so it brings the early work together with, whatever. This is just a flooded staircase from New England. I think the water is taking on it's just basic associations of unconscious, psychological. Here this is after 9/11 and our invasion of Iraq, and I found this beautiful image in The Guardian. I think it was on a train somewhere in Belgium, and the room was filled with Taliban soldiers who had been taken captive and were later taken to in boxcars by American forces, where they were left to die, essentially, in the desert in these overheated boxcars. It was like an atrocity, and it got a little bit of press, not a lot of attention, but a lot of people died. And I reshot the space with nobody there. And when I was done, it looks remarkably like the space itself that contained the people. It's so similar to the original photo. So during this period, prior to the invasion of Iraq, I was just like scrambling for, ways to think about our connection to other cultures in a positive way, and I began to look back at the Middle Ages and the 10th century and to think about this era when there was a lot of actual cooperation between Muslims, Jews, Christians, and a lot of exchange, intellectual and otherwise. And the wars that were being fought by competing kingdoms, but it wasn't over religion. And it was really we think of it as the Dark Ages, but as many of you know, it was a real flowering of learning and knowledge. And so this is based on a space in Andalusia, maybe Siena. I went there later to actually look at it, and it's beautiful still. This is just a reflecting pool in the same region. And then I took a few trips to Istanbul, and this is based on a dormitory at Topkapi Palace, where one of my favorite architects grew up. He was taken prisoner by the Ottomans from one of their outlying territories, and as a slave was raised here and trained as an engineer and architect eventually, and built more widely than any architect to date. So throughout the empire at its height in the 16th century, outlasting one leader of the empire after another. So it's Mimar Sinan, and I spent some time visiting different madrasas and mosques and compounds of his, not only in Istanbul, but north of there in Turkey. And I could not capture the beauty of his work, actually. And the things that really impressed me were his urban planning and the intimacy of the spaces in many of the madrasas and the way the plans work. So I shot a couple of pictures based on the grandeur of the mosque, I guess. And then I got a commission to install some work in a new high school designed by Architectonica in Ozone Park, New York. And it's a primarily Islamic and Hindu neighborhood, kind of mixed. And so I managed to get these 3 pieces installed permanently in the walls of the building. This is a theater. It was designed after the theater at the Acropolis in one of its many incarnations throughout history. And it's it's quite large, as you can see, but it's on this wall that slants out over the viewer. This is Tripoli in Lebanon, a place derided in the American press, fearful place where so many terrorists are living. And I began, I was thinking we need to do something about this image. So I tried to depict it as a beautiful beach town at night with happy people living normal lives, basically. That was shot some more images along these lines from North Africa. This is one of the final images I shot out of a series that were about the American Extraordinary Rendition Program, where we would take terrorist suspects to third countries and torture them on foreign lands. And anyway, the other images are much more minimal. So I came back to America, so to speak, in the work during the mortgage crisis of 2008, and revisited the suburbs and began to see how they had changed since I was a kid growing up. I mean, I'd left at 18, lived in New York City. I hadn't been there really much since, but I had a house in the upstate, and I would just never stop between here and there. And I began to stop like near Poughkeepsie and drive around these neighborhoods and see find out what a mansion really was and find out what kind of developments were really there. So I did this whole body of work based on this moment of economic collapse around housing. Yeah. This is just one installation in Madrid, I guess. So the photographs at this point are about 6 by 8 feet. And this is my studio where I was building these things in Brooklyn. Just some of the parts and some of the, I would, go online and find houses for sale on real estate sites and draw them out and build them, and then we would make more. Here are I'm also thinking about climate change and, the city's on fire, the suburbs on fire in California and such. I had a little bit of a transition where I started thinking about climate more and more, and this picture, or this house, I'd been obsessed with for about 30 years, and I think the image itself came from Vincent Scully's Shingle Style book, but it really was this archetype of a beach house for me. It was a life-saving station where boats would be housed. So there were doors on either side of it for rowboats. And these were life-saving stations to rescue stranded mariners on the East Coast that would, hit a boulder or they would sink, and these guys would go out and rescue them. But I began to think of that in relation to, rising sea levels. This image was done for the cover of New York Times Magazine, and it had a title at the top which said, "Boom or Doom." So I had to flip the image so that boom was on the left and the doom was on the right. But, and again, it was during the Obama administration when there was a debate going on between different economic advisors on how to proceed. So it was fun. And then I've started thinking about just landscape, the history of landscape painting, and Caspar David Friedrich, and in relation to these issues. And so I shot this picture based on his famous painting of the 1830s, The Sea of Ice, or otherwise known as The Wreck of Hope, which was about a ship that went down in the Arctic. So this was my picture that resulted. This is what it was made out of. Basically, it's a resin that's made to look like water, and it was carved out of pink styrofoam, covered in joint compound, painted, and it took about 64 exposures at this point to get the depth of field, so it was all sharp. This is a kind of bad reproduction of the original painting, but you can see the ship Hope over there on the right. I eliminated that from my photo. It didn't really work visually and didn't have any relevance. But so then I was asked to do essentially a survey show of my work at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. And this was a building that went up in the mid-1930s. Groundbreaking was done with Adolf Hitler present with a shovel, and it was originally the House of German Art. So I wanted to do something that just brought attention to the museum itself as a backdrop for spectacle, for political rallies and for the right. And so I did this mural that basically wrapped around 3 walls of the staircase leading from the ground floor up to the second floor where the show was. And this is looking out from the second floor. And, after thinking so much about the parallels between the 1930s in Germany and the United States during the election, I was getting a little depressed. And so I kind of sought refuge in Mexico. So for me, I wanted to, here we have a presidential candidate who's demonizing Mexican immigrants. And so I go to Mexico and I want to bring back some of the, kind of like Mimar Sinan, some of the beauty of their cultural achievements, and central of which is Louis Barragan. So I did a whole exhibition based on his work primarily in Mexico City. And This model is actually of his studio at his home and studio in Mexico City. This is like a porch at another one of his houses. That's Harper, my friend and assistant, who was here for the Halloween party. She happened to be in Rome for another opening in Torino. Yeah, this is the photo that resulted from that set. I only included a few of these. There's a lot of pictures. This, where I flooded the courtyard, it was interesting. I went there to the house and I showed the photo to the owner, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is a miracle. This is exactly what happened just a month ago in this rainstorm. The whole place flooded." And I thought that was funny. But it's not one of my favorite houses, but it's a, yeah. This is one of his yellow hallways. Same building, actually. Beautiful space with yellow light coming from the yellow stained glass. And I took a lot of these architectural ideas and began to kind of design things myself. So there's a famous house in a famous building called El Eco, which is an experimental art space in Mexico City designed by actually Matthias Gerritz, who was a sculptor, German emigre to Mexico, and a friend of Berrigan's. And Berrigan was a consultant on the project. But anyway, I manipulated the plan and turned it into a freestanding house and put it in the water. And so this was really the first of this series of images that I called On the Water's Edge, where I created houses that were a combination of lifeguard station, beach house, temporary refuge for fleeing homeless people. And this, however, was based on a famous Herzog and de Meuron house on the border of Switzerland and France, which I changed a little bit, but I found beautiful. So just stealing some of the architectural ideas, adding my own color. This is actually a reference to a Paul Rudolph house in South Florida, where he did these amazing Florida beach houses in the 1950s. You didn't drop them right in the sea like that. But so I finished that show. I came to Rome and decided to leave my camera behind and just began to think about what I saw, the sculpture and the architecture, and make models. And this very crude model became the departure point for this. So it was essentially, well, I'm not going to say a lot because I included a little short videotape where I do it. It was posted on Instagram by the Brooklyn Rail. But this is an image of the inside. This is the son of a friend of mine leaping off the edge. And this is the video. So I'll let this speak. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, let's see. When I returned from Rome at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, I brought with me the plans to build this solo pavilion and imagined a group of them scattered about in a public space. I decided to have one of the units built here in New York as a prototype, and I found a shop in Hudson that could construct it out of CLT, my chosen material. I was going to simply put it next to my studio to show people once it was done in the hopes of finding a public venue. But after being introduced to the director of PS21, a relatively new and fantastic outdoor performance space on a 100-acre plot of land just north of downtown Chatham, I was invited to explore and to find a place to put it there. I selected a spot on the top of a hill, visible from many directions, adjacent to the open-air theater and with a view that looked out over the Hudson Valley. I arrived at this particular form in Rome after going there in September of 2019, intent on thinking about real space, that is, this sculpture and architecture. What impacted me as salient or beautiful about Rome is the street culture, the outdoor eating spaces, squares, or piazzas. I wanted to take these Roman outdoor living rooms, the negative space at irregular intersections, and turn them into positive and at least
partially enclosed spaces that were slightly more protected, partly by dropping a roof on them and inserting a Pantheon-like oculus in the middle, creating intimate space that also felt quite open. By being outdoors and not inside a white box, the solo pavilion draws attention primarily to the world around it, framing vistas and changing every day with the weather, the temperature, the light, the clouds, the humidity, the insects, and wildlife. It is awkwardly inviting and offers a sense of limited protection because of the large openings and its sloping roof. It slices the view just below the horizon when you poke your head out of the skylight. While firmly mounted on this hill, it's also tilted and off balance. It suggests motion, the motion of the object, the viewer, the motion of the earth, and everything beyond. This experience suggests an emphasis on change, transience, and contingency. It opens one's eyes to the surroundings in a way that is fragmented or fractured. It's porous. In not being enclosed, you are connected. In not being so protected, you are vulnerable.
So it became quite popular. And anyway, this was an opening, so it's not like this every day. It's, it's out in the middle of nowhere. But for theatrical events, it's an outdoor theater, so they were doing performances throughout the pandemic in an open air environment. So lastly, I'm just going to show a few things that I've been working on recently that grew out of this photograph in the foreground on the left. Has a kind of really irregular structure at the bottom. This was borrowed from a Japanese architect, the basic form, and then altered, and I changed the color and simplified it and such. But that irregular shape just kind of intrigued me, and I started making these. This should start, shouldn't it? Just on its own. It's a video or walk around. But I took that one basic shape and began to manipulate it, to combine it with other shapes like it, and create other new forms. And I would build the original out of styrofoam, like foam core, and then we did a lot of digital work and made it possible to build it out of bamboo plywood and then blacken it with this Japanese shugiban method of burning the wood to preserve it, to make it weather resistant. So this is the first one that I did, and then I've been making more, less horizontal, a little bit more full body size, and this is just, if it'll play, yeah, it's just a video walk around this piece. So let's see, and this is the last image in that series that I have, just as it's being completed. And that's where I'm going to end the talk. Thank you for your patience. Pardon me? Sure. Peter?
I'll let David sit down first. I'm interested in how each of you thinks about the relationship between words and the visual artifacts you're creating. I mean, David, it seemed to me you talked about interpretive signage, but also seemed to be resisting it at times. And James, it seems, at least from what you supplied, that you started with fairly elaborate titles for things, and as you're presentation progressed, you seem to me at least to stop giving us titles. So I'm wondering, like, about your feeling of, are the titles essential parts of the work, or would you prefer to dispense with them, or has it changed, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Well, in my case, you're right. I did start out being really quite influenced by poetry and literature generally, and words were a large part of the content, I think. Like, in terms of the one that was called Bacillus pestis, I mean, that's the Latin name for the plague, and so I think I said that. But it was also meant to be kind of a multimedia piece where you would actually listen to the music, like maybe you could put on headphones and hear that rondo and experience it in a multimedia fashion. But the earlier work was, more about language, in fact, and I did kind of let that fall by the wayside. I mean, the big black thing is called a battle beetle. It's not very poetic, I suppose, but it's meant to refer to the battle we were having with the Japanese beetle in the West, and also in my own environment, the spongy moths, previously known as gypsy moths, that were devastating the forest and killing all the oak trees around my house. So it's just to direct the viewer in a certain way, but it's not, doesn't take on the same poetic significance that earlier work. I did supply earlier work with titles to that end. They got very descriptive as I went on, but
In regards to my work, I really think of the texts really as materials, as material, and almost like the ingredients on a label for something in a way. I mean, I remember the way I was taught in undergrad school was like the work has to speak for its own, and just this thing in the middle of a room, and like, what is that? And it has to be able to say everything it needs to say with that. And then I kind of later in life, it's like, but that's not true. Because I mean, what if that plywood is from the sculpture is made of plywood? It's about plywood, but what if that plywood is from Peru, and now it's about plywood in this kind of larger kind of global system of extraction and circulation, and so. And that really happened as when I was making work that was just kind of a thing that was sitting in the middle of the room. I started questioning the materiality of it, but also where the floor come from, and then kind of doing research on my own building and studio and where that floor would have originally come from and where the forests were from. And so I couldn't not see it in that way. And so the didactic material is there. Sometimes it's more necessary than others, but it's also just a way to understand the context of what the material really is, and then use the text as material in that way, like a piece of wood or something. So, that's kind of how I think about it.
It's more like a comment, but we called it. It was sort of interesting to see, like in David, in your work, you are really interested in non-human life, and to actually show the kinds of to bring things to the fore which we sometimes just pass through, and also to show the sort of violence against nature, right? That's happening. And yet there's an interesting way in which the machine is important, like Marx's machine in the garden, but you kind of dismantle the machine and bury it in many ways. And I found in James' work, especially the earlier ones, for a long time actually in your work, you magnify this sort of everyday landscape, and with the sort of shadows and magnifications, actually there's a familiarity, but you also bring a great amount of fear. I mean, to the viewer, the uncanny comes, the threatening comes, a lot of it. In a way, you animate the non-living in sort of interesting sort of ways, and make us aware of other kinds of things that are around us. It's some parts remind me of Esther's work, but yours is much more architectural in a formal way as well, and then you bring water. So anyway, just wanted to say something.
I think that's a great notion of the idea of animating the living. Just watching the images again here, it's like, yeah, the projections, the reverberations that the ideology behind the design of the space gives off kind of becomes its own persona in a way, its own specter. You know, it's animating the non-living in that sense for me, and how I was watching Jim kind of move through the images. Yeah.
I love the way I'm not like a film noir expert or obsessive, but the way the city itself is often used as a major character in film noir, and that's, you know, I guess the uncanny coming in another way. Tom?
Yeah, this is also just a comment. I mean, one of the things, when I look at art, it's when I look away from it and what it does to perception. And after looking at your work, James, this room almost becomes terrifying to me. I mean, I just start thinking, uh-oh, I'm starting to look at the way you do, or the way you're compelling me to. I guess I have to wait till I go outside to figure out what you're doing to me, David. It's just a comment. I don't expect you to say anything.
I deleted a photograph that I shot of a classroom in Asmara, which is North Africa in Somalia, I guess, right? It's basically a Italian colonial town built in the early 20th century, which is very modern. It's like, it has great examples of 20th century modernism, but there's one building which I think it's called the House of Fascism or something, but I shot a picture of this beautiful space with a vaulted ceiling, actually, and a fairly ornate barrier in the front, and flooded it. But it's a classroom. I've done some other classrooms too. But anyway, just side note.
Hi. Could you all talk a little bit about your process of creating art? I know you elaborated on it, but like your choice of materials, what drives your choices? And a lot of times in art, it's like taboo to talk about money. And so does that drive, you know, some of the materials you might choose? Or could you all, I was really intrigued about the use of water. And how did you create that? Was that actual, did you flood a space, or did you use some sort of material to do that? Could you all please talk about that?
Sure.
Money is always a tricky topic, but yeah, it's I work in different relationships with it. Sometimes I fund projects on my own completely, and then sometimes it's a budget from a commission. But I always end up having to fundraise on my own and do that. I mean, I also fundraise for these biodiversity surveys we do, so it's kind of a process I've been doing now for quite a while, kind of getting accustomed to it, as frustrating as it always is. But for instance, it's also, I think of it materially, like the text becomes material. Also, so does where the budget is, where the funding's coming from, and what can it actually do. So the early process of like the desert rooftops piece was being sponsored by Sotheby's. So they had pretty deep pockets. And so it cost 35% more in the budget to make the project so it can come back apart. Because usually that type of a rooftop is almost disposable architecture in a way. Like you just kind of make it and it falls apart. But so we, it was a thing that, so I knew that we could do that now. So we had a certain budget element. So we can, in a sort of tiny drop in the bucket Robin Hood moment, you can kind of design it, use it in that way, and then let it become something else. So materially, budget-wise, it's always kind of tied in, and I think of it materially in that sense. So, and in terms of materials in general, I try to work with people and do research with them and figure out where their expertise is, and often try to let them, the people I'm working with, like it's also their project, and so to let them kind of dictate like what trees, what material, what all of these kind of elements of it. How is the concrete mixed? How is it sprayable? How is it pourable? So it's really letting the people that are really expertise can do far more than I can do on my own, that dictate it. And so it's that collaborative moment. Before graduate school, I worked for 5 years as a project manager with an architect. Of course, I completely lied on my resume and had no experience whatsoever, but I figured it out. And so I learned how to work with a large group of people in this more collaborative nature, as opposed to just telling them what to do. So that's often part of it as well.
In my case, some of the earlier, larger scale installations were paid for by different cultural institutions that commissioned it, and whether it was the University of South Florida, the Walker Art Center, the Sonsbeck 86. But the photographs, I guess I rely on sales primarily. I fund them myself and then hope that they'll sell and pay my bills. And it was a long time before they did, but eventually they did. And then, recently that's changed because of this, but not entirely. A lot of the sculpture I'm funding myself, but like the first pavilion. But now that people have seen it, there's a university that's commissioning one in North Carolina, and hopefully, it's in process, so it looks like it's going to happen. And I'm, finding ways to get it produced well and cheaply. Yeah, so the commissioning process is something I'm not used to anymore. But actually, a lot of works, like the Boom and Doom magazine cover was the New York Times. There are a couple other images they've commissioned over time, and sometimes I'll make money and sometimes not, because I'll have a crew, up to 6 or 7 people helping on some of these models, and but working very quickly, with newspaper deadlines, which is actually fun. I love a good deadline, actually. So it's true. But it also depends on the talents of the people I employ, actually, the direction the work goes. I have to say that, I had a guy I hired whose parents were dentists, or dental artists. He said they worked in the dental arts, and so he was really good with working miniature. So some of those large landscapes with houses, he'd make these tiny little bicycles, and he was so good at making tiny things. That's kind of where I let the work go. And you have to, you have to be flexible that way sometimes, and it's a great thing. But since Rome, I've been pretty much working on my own, with the exception that I'm doing the original model and the concept, and then I take that crude green model, and I have, in this case, I had it scanned here in Rome by another fellow who worked in virtual reality, and Matt Brennan, and we did a virtual reality walkthrough of the space, and so I could decide what scale I wanted to build the final object in by actually being inside it and walking around it, and in virtual reality. And then since then, the black pieces, there too, I'm making fairly crude models out of foam core, whether it be white or black. Actually, I did it all in white. I had another assistant fine-tune it in black foam core. We scanned it. We finally got it into Rhino after doing it in other programs, and fine-tuned it to standardize the components to make it buildable. And then I went to a number of different fabricators to find somebody who could do it at a reasonable price, and took it in all directions. One fabricator wanted me to do all the joints either 90 degrees or 25 degrees. And so I did, and it took weeks. And then I took it to someone else, and they said, oh no, we can do these miters just the way they are. And they, without charge, simply changed the drawings and did it perfectly. And so what I'm finding is that when you deal with fabricators, the price range is enormous. I've had pieces get bid at The second pavilion I'm working on now, I got a bid in Mexico City for like 26 grand, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? I got a bid in New York City for over $600,000 for the same thing. So, you know, you really have to fish around and figure out what's happening and work with people who can do it right at the right price. So that's a big, you know, that's a new challenge I have at trying to get these things built. Let's see, otherwise in materials.
The water, like.
Yeah, the water is called Easy Water. You can get it online. And it's made, made for, pardon me?
Or from your tap.
Well, no, it's.
I don't think you can use that, right? Like,
No,
did
no.
it gel?
Yeah, it's a crystal basically that you melt in a coffee can on your stove, and you can pour it out on the surface and then create whatever kind of texture you want with a heat gun. So you can make it smooth, you can make it wavy, rough. It's hard to create real waves.
That's trademark information.
Yeah, this information does not leave the room. But so I buy it by the box, you know, and you get it in little packets at hobby stores. But yeah, and I guess in terms of the wood and things, other materials I'm using, I'm trying to work with sustainable materials. You know, like the bamboo is plywood. It's thin. It's, you know, it's lightweight, easier to ship, that kind of thing. But I'm starting on subsequent projects to work with aluminum and painted aluminum and polished brass and things like that. So I haven't stopped with the darkness of these futuristic battle beetles. It's, you know, continue to work with the same notion of like modular structures, but in slightly off balance ways, but also using color and other metals. So sort of branching out.
I think with that, I know that there may be other questions. I want to invite people upstairs to have a chance, if James, there's 15 minutes before lunch starts. So maybe we'll close this part of our talk here with a big round of thanks to David and James for sharing their work. Otherwise, we look forward to continuing the conversation over lunch and as the rest of the weeks and, well, days that you're here.
Yeah, 2 days, 2 more days.
Thank you.
Thank you.